I'm Any New Province, and this week we're going to find out if Sarah Disciple and Artificer's Assistant are possibly Pauper playable. Both of these brand new birds came to the Pauper format with the release of Dominaria. They both care about you casting artifacts, so I decided I would build a Spellbomb deck. Before I break down the birds for you, I just want to let you know that another Pauper YouTuber has a great Spellbomb deck called Bomberman. Their name's Lowbird. I'll link the video in the description down below. I'm going to start off by explaining the two new birds. First, we have Sarah Disciple, which costs 1 and a white for a 1/1 flying first striker, and whenever you cast a historic spell, which in Pauper is just artifacts, Sarah Disciple gets +1/+1 until end of turn. I definitely undervalued this card before I started testing with it. On the surface, it looks like you should cast a ton of artifact cards to make Sarah Disciple into an explosive, aggressive threat. In reality, Sarah Disciple's first strike ability actually gives it a lot of versatility on defense. You can get Sarah Disciple in the way of your opponent's Delver of Secrets, pump it at instant speed, and then kill off their creature without losing your own threat. Next is Artificer's Assistant, which costs 1 blue for a 1/1 flyer, which is anemic on its own, but whenever you cast a historic spell, you get to scry 1. Our deck relies heavily on synergy, so the scry ability on Artificer's Assistant really helps us draw into the right half of our deck when we need it. Sometimes we just want another artifact spell to pump up our Sarah Disciple, but other times we need a cantrip so we can keep our land drops flowing. Artificer's Assistant and Sarah Disciple are both at their core 1/1 flyers, so I thought for this deck to get there, we were going to need some more aggressive threats to go along with them. First, we have Auriok Sunchaser, which costs 1 and a white for a 1/1 with Metalcraft, which means as long as you control 3 or more artifacts, Auriok Sunchaser gets +2/+2 and has flying. A 2-mana 3/3 flyer is a great threat. The reason there's only 2 here is because we cash in a lot of our artifacts, so we can't always guarantee that we'll have 3 on the battlefield at a time. Our last aggressive threat is Seeker of the Way, and it may very well be our best one. It costs 1 and a white for a 2/2 with Prowess, which means whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Also, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Seeker of the Way gains lifelink until end of turn. In this deck, Seeker of the Way is effectively another 4 copies of Sarah Disciple that has lifelink instead of evasion. All of our artifact spells are going to pump it up, and we can even include a few other non-creature spells to help it along the way. Next, we have some interaction to help out Seeker of the Way with those prowess triggers, but also to clear our opponent's board to sneak in our big attackers early in the game. Our first interactive spell is Vapor Snag. It's 1 blue for an instant that returns target creature to its owner's hand. Its controller loses 1 life. While Seeker of the Way is on the battlefield, this can represent a 7-point life swing, but it can also help protect our fragile threats from our opponent's interaction. We've also got 3 Journey to Nowheres, which cost 1 and a white for an enchantment that says, when Journey to Nowhere enters the battlefield, exile target creature. When Journey to Nowhere leaves the battlefield, return the exiled creature to the battlefield under its owner's control. Our pumped up creatures can attack through almost anything, but we need these catch-all threats so that we can exile our opponent's Spire Golems and Gurmag Anglers to stop them getting in the way. I've also included some card filtering and card advantage because they do go great with Seeker of the Way, but they can also help smooth out some of the other inconsistencies in our deck. First, we have Preordain, which costs 1 blue for a sorcery and it says scry 2, draw a card. We've also got Think Twice, which costs 1 and a blue for an instant that draws you a card. You can also pay its flashback cost, which is 2 and a blue, to exile it from your graveyard and cast it again. Think Twice is a fine cantrip on its own, but the reason it's so great here is that we can trigger Seeker of the Way's prowess and lifelink ability twice with it at instant speed. Leonin Squire is our last bit of card advantage. It costs 1 and a white for a 2/2, and when it enters the battlefield, you can return target artifact card with converted mana cost 1 or less from your graveyard to your hand. Being able to buy back our spell bombs after we've already used them once is good enough on its own, but with Leonin Squire and Lotus Petal, you can also have really explosive turn 1s where you have 3 or 4 power on the battlefield. Finally, we have our artifacts, some of the coolest spells in the deck. First, we have Lotus Petal, which is a 0-mana artifact that you can tap and sacrifice to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Next, we have 1 copy of Chromatic Star over the 4th copy of Lotus Petal. It costs 1 mana and you can pay 1, tap it, and sacrifice it to add 1 mana of any color. When it's put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you draw a card. Next is our namesake Spellbombs. We have 1 copy of Aether Spellbomb, which costs a generic mana, and you can pay a blue, sacrifice Aether Spellbomb, and return target creature to its owner's hand. We can use this to get our opponent's creatures out of the way or protect our own creatures. If we don't have to do either of those things, we can pay 1 generic mana, sacrifice Aether Spellbomb, and draw a card. Next, we have 3 copies of Pyrite Spellbomb, which necessitates a little bit of a splash into red and also explains all of our color fixing artifacts. It costs 1 generic mana, and you can pay red, sacrifice it to deal 2 damage to any target. If you don't need to do that, you can also pay 1 and sacrifice it to draw a card. One of the coolest things this deck can do is buy back all of the artifacts I've mentioned so far with Leonin Squire. We can play our Leonin Squire out, get back an artifact, cast it, and trigger all of our creatures on the battlefield again. The only artifact we can't buy back with Leonin Squire has to be in this deck anyway. It's Tooth of Chisgora. It costs 3 generic mana, it has Flash, meaning that we can use it to trigger our Seeker of the Way or Serra Disciple at instant speed. It has affinity for artifacts, which means it costs 1 less for each artifact we control, and you can tap it to give target creature +1/+0 until end of turn. It has been so fun to play with this card so far. It turns almost all of our little flyers into vertible threats, and you can really surprise your opponent by pumping up 2 of your creatures and giving your first striker an extra +1/+0. Alright, let's have a look at this mana base. First, we have 8 artifact lands, 4 Ancient Dens that tap for white, and 4 Seed of the Synod that tap for blue. We need lots of artifacts to keep our Auriok Sun Chasers online and to keep our Teeth of Chisgora nice and cheap. Next, we have Azorius Chancery, your Azorius Karoo. When it enters the battlefield, you have to return a land you control to your hand. It also enters the battlefield tapped. When it becomes untapped, it taps for white and blue. Next, we have 4 Evolving Wilds, just your standard Pauper fetches. You can tap them, sacrifice them, search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. These are a little bit slow for our strategies, but if we're going to have a red splash, then we're gonna need a way to find those mountains. Finally, we have our basics, 3 basic islands, 2 basic plains, and 2 basic mountains. We have just enough basics so that we can do turn 1 Preordain or Leonin Squire with a Lotus Petal, and we also have 2 mountains for some of our greedy sideboard cards. And here's the sideboard. First, we have 3 standard bearers for picking up all of our opponent's pump spells and auras. We have 2 dispels to be a little bit more efficient when we're trying to force through threats or stop our opponent from casting pump spells. We have 3 Hydroblasts to really lock up that burn matchup. We have 2 Electricaries to wrath our opponent's boards if they're on all X ones. We have 2 Gorilla Shamans for blowing up all of Affinity's lands. We have 2 Celestial Flares if our opponents are trying to boggle up. And we have 1 Patrician Scorn, just in case our opponent's trying to boggle up. And there it is, Jeskai Spellbombs featuring Serra Disciple and Artificer's Assistant. We're going to take this deck live into a league at twitch.tv/AnyNewProvince this Tuesday night at 7 p.m. Atlantic Time. We're there every Tuesday night playing possibly Pauper playable decks. Before I go, I just want to remind you that you can like the video or subscribe to the channel down below. I'd seriously appreciate it. It's a great way to let me know you've enjoyed everything, and it really encourages me to keep making great Pauper content. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this deck tech, and hopefully I'll see you on Tuesday night.